absolute genius, and it was such a warm reception. They had invited the mayor and they were waiting for him to come in. But the MC said, you know, we're Africans, so while we're waiting for the mayor, go over there and get yourself some food. Go over and touch Brother Karinga, talk to him. It was just wonderful activity. And then, of course, the mayor came in and did something that I hope that he isn't regretting today. He gave Brother Karinga a proclamation and indicated that this was the way for us to go. There's only one camera there, mind you. One camera and a lot of African photographers. It was a very splendid occasion, something that that we can really be very, very proud of. I am so sorry to see that this auditorium is as empty as it is. This is our third move, and we've got to bring our crowd back. We're going to ask you to help us do that. This place is a little difficult to find, but once we're here, I think this is a splendid place for us to hold our forums. We can stay here until 6 o'clock. We have plenty of space. It's very comfortable. We have a lovely stage that we can use. So we're going to ask each of you to help us to build the attendance back up to where it should be. And having said all that, I want to again thank you for your presence, your support, and ask you to continue in the struggle with us. And I'm going to ask Dr. Daniel McIntosh to now come to the microphone. Thank you for God and Hotep.
Hotep, brothers and sisters. Let's have a hand for all the people who made this event possible today. I'm deliberately saying that because, you know, Sister Betty addressed the fact that the auditorium is not as filled as it could be. But do you know that you have to break your neck and work like crazy just to bring this number of people in? That basically people had to work to get the mailing out that went out. And that the reason, one of the reasons, I mean, that I can think of 2 or 3 reasons really that have nothing to do with the labor that the SMOTAP members put in that are responsible for the crowd today. 2 or 3 reasons, and it's not even reflective of the interest or disinterest that people have in what SMOTAP is doing. One of the factors is that even though we use the expression black media, there are all kinds of interests that control media and all types of factors that go into what the media publishes. So that on some days, the media will publish our press release announcing a program, black media included. And on other days, they won't. If it's a week when the Amsterdam publishes it, there are more people. Another thing is that sometimes we're able to get on to radio station WLIB and announce it. If that happens, then there are more people, and if it doesn't, there are not as many people. And what we had this time is that the only paper that ran the information was the City Sun. They have a little space that they sell to you, an announcement page. And consequently, since the Amsterdam didn't run the press release, the same press release was written, you know, the same work went into it, the same work had to go into taking it there to the Amsterdam. Everything was done the same way. Another factor was the fact that when we started out, we were church-based, and it was very easy to disseminate the information in the place where we held our meetings. Now, for various reasons, we are not in a situation where we can hold our meetings there every week. We had to we've moved to about, I guess, 3 or 4 other places we've had forums. Each place, I don't know, something seems to go wrong. I don't know if people don't like us. I don't know, it might be the way. I thought I had a snazzy European, what do you call this thing? Blazer on, but I don't know if that's it, or if it's something in what our speakers are saying. Nevertheless, I believe that the group of people we have here, we're going to make up in spirit what we might not have in numbers. We're very appreciative of you who came and showed up. We believe you're the most important people in the world. We're very appreciative of our executive committee. We're very appreciative of the laborers who do the various things to try to raise the funds for Samotap to continue to provide the service that it provides. We're very appreciative of our community, and we're appreciative of the geniuses that are in the community and the hard workers that are in the community, like today's speaker, Brother Amos Wilson. You know, in these movies like The Godfather or some of these gangster movies, there comes a moment in the struggle where, their struggle now, you know, where things get real hot and you have to go to the mats. And that means they bring their mattress in and they put it right in the same place where they work and they, you know, do all that sort of thing. I went and I visited Brother Amos this morning. I think the brother has gone to the mats. He's been to the mats for a long time. He lives very simply, throws all of his energy into his work, works for himself, works for ourselves. And I hope that we will support the business that he has restarted. He's back in the printing business. So if we have something to print, I hope we'll, be running over to the Bronx. He'll tell you where the location is placed and tell you when he'll be ready to receive some of your business. I don't know if he's going to put some bookstores in there, but he had a nice open space, and it looked like a nice space where the Samotap forum might be held. This would have been a good place to hold today's forum. The brother has been around for a while. He used to be a teacher at De Hostos College. And a lot of people will call him Dr. Wilson and so on and so forth. The highest accolade you can give to somebody is call him Brother Wilson, because we don't have really many schools that really bestow these degrees and things on people. And there are people who exist in the community who can literally tell those people who have earned those degrees in some of those places where they bestow degrees, they could tell them to take their degree and make it into toilet paper. There are people who don't have degrees themselves who could tell other people who are in their same field to take their degree and make it into toilet paper. For instance, Professor John Henry Clark doesn't even have didn't even graduate from high school. The world's foremost African historian did not graduate from high school. He earned a GED. He did a little college. But basically, he was self-taught and learned under Schomburg and learned through his own private research. But if we can't call him doctor, we're crazy. Eventually, he was given an honorary doctorate, I think, by the University of Denver. But a lot of our greatest minds don't have these white man's credentials because there are people who are in charge of granting the credentials. Brother Amos Wilson may be a doctor now, but he's been a doctor for a long time. He's been a doctor for a long time because of the depth of the research that he does and because of the kind of Afrocentric insight that he brings to it. His first book to come to my attention was The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, and it stands out there alone. Any black person who wants to know something about the development of our children, you have to go to that book. He had another book in between there that I believe was on various types of therapies, and the current book that is very popular is a book called Black on Black Violence, and it has a subtitle which makes reference to the fact that even black on black violence is in some way serving white domination. The brother is a wonderful lecturer, always learn something every time I sit and listen to him. He is the highest meaning of doctor, and he could tell me to take my little piece of thing and make toilet paper out of it. I hope we'll give him a warm greeting and that we will tune our ears and our consciousness to receive some of the information that he has for us. Brothers and sisters, let's give a spirited welcome to Brother Dr. Amos Wilson.
An introduction like that, I was outspoiled with speech. I'm very, very pleased to have been invited to speak with you here today, and I'm certainly aware that there are a lot of competing events going on all over the place. So I can appreciate your coming here today because there are just so many things going on and wonderful, great things happening here this weekend. And so I appreciate your taking the time to appear here today. I hope not to take up too much of your time so that perhaps you will get a chance to look at some of the other events. I want to also thank you for your response to Black on Black violence, which is doing quite well, even though I hear that it's putting some of you through some sort of vocabulary hoops there. But hang in with it. It is a book I think you have to sort of perhaps read a couple of times. I think the thing that throws most people is the hyphenations. If you kind of look at it a little closer, you'll see that it's just old words sort of sewn together with hyphens in order to sort of deal with some concepts I think that are not dealt with in everyday life and dealt with in terms of where we are as a people. The outline of the book is, I think, very simple. Obviously, the first section deals with the presentation of the statistics, the so-called crime statistics, followed by the idea that these statistics have to be very carefully scrutinized, that they create halos that do not necessarily represent reality, and that's really what that is about, to sort of warn you as to how they are used to create points of view and misperceptions relative to our people. The essence of that text is to indicate that so-called black-on-black criminality, black-on-black violence, is a social act, that crime is a social act. It is a social interaction. It's not one that people desire necessarily, but it is a form of social interaction. And it occurs within a social context. Crime occurs within a society. And it is motivated by social values and ideas. So if people mug, they mug to often get money to buy things that the media and other propaganda organizations have told them are valuable. Things that they've been made to think will enhance their self-image, their social status. So what I'm trying to get across there is that a good deal of so-called criminality and violence is generated by the society itself, by the nature of its marketing system. And therefore you cannot detach criminality and criminal acts and even black-on-black violence from the nature of the social system in which it occurs. And this is the essence of what we're talking about here. This is followed by the idea then that black-on-black violence, being motivated, instigated to a great extent by the social system in which it occurs, then functions to maintain that system. You see, to keep that system sustained. You see, and this is the way we have to, and I'm trying to get a different vision here, to move you from the standard European idea that crime is purely an individual act and it purely flows out of the evil within the individual's mind. This is a tendency of European sociologists and criminologists who are in the end apologists for the social system. And by making it appear that crime flows out of an individual criminal nature, from an individual criminal personality, You do not look at the social system as a cause of crime, as an instigator of crime. You do not see criminality in segments of that social system as necessary to maintaining that system. And therefore, you get engaged in self-blame and in blaming the victim, and you cooperate with the system against your own survival. And this is what we're talking about here. And this is what, in essence, this book is about. It means then that the transformation of criminality in the African American community must involve a transformation of the African American community, not a mere rehabilitation of individual criminals. You see, you got this whole concept of so-called rehabilitation. And the idea is that you sit down in some group sessions or some one-on-one sessions and you somehow rehabilitate criminals and you somehow reduce the crime rate. Another Eurocentric myth. I try to tell my class all the time, the one that I'm doing on children at risk, about their going into courses in special ed where they get recipes and descriptions of learning disabled children. And they're made to think that once they learn all of the characteristics and the techniques, that they are going to have a significant impact in transforming those children. Not on your life. These children are being created by this system by the thousands. And you're not going to get enough social workers and therapists and school psychologists and counselors doing one-on-one therapy and small group therapy stuff to transform this situation. Even though we use them and we can need them, but this is not going to transform the situation. Because learning disableness is a political necessity in this society, and the inability, so-called, of many of our children to learn is necessary to maintain this social system, and it is generated by this social system. And yet the system wants to make you think that you can sweep back the ocean with the broom. No. Communal transformations have to take place, both within the African American community and ultimately in the so-called broader American community, if we are to transform the problems that are occurring in our classes and in our streets. So perhaps sometimes people are having some problem with trying to move from the standard frames of reference which deal with individualism and approach problems from individualistic points of view to an effort to look at them on a different level. Hang in with the text. In that context, I'm going to do a little self-advertising here. It might be helpful to read an upcoming publication coming out back toward the back end of January called An Outline for Understanding, Remediating, and Preventing Black Adolescent Violence. So you can look for that about the end of February. It's an outline essentially of about 100, maybe 120 pages. And perhaps this will be helpful in interpreting the black-on-black violence. Here we're going to look at then how so-called black-on-black violence is created by white-on-black violence. The violence that begets violence. And how whites have engaged in unrelentless violence against black people. Right up to this very second, it has never stopped. From the very first moment we came into contact with these people, the violence on all levels, not only the violence of slavery, the violence of peonage during Reconstruction and so forth, the violence of Jim Crowism, the violence of lynching, but also the violence of economic deprivation, the violence of the assassination of black culture and of the black character, violence in terms of injustice, violence in terms of miseducation, on and on and on it goes, and it has gone. And this violence has caused violent reactions in our people. You mix that then with the nature of adolescence in America, where adolescence itself represents a struggle for identity, a struggle to define one's future course in life, a struggle to determine one's occupational and vocational career, a struggle to determine one's gender identity, race identity, and the other struggles of adolescence. You combine that with the unrelenting assault on the black community, with the psychological after effects and the psychological effects that are pervasive throughout the black community as a result of these assaults. And then you combine that further with the ecological or physical, political environment that our youth had to live in. The so-called ghettos, the high levels of unemployment, the miseducation, the overflow of drugs, the overflow of weapons, the tremendous attack of the mass media on the desiring structure of our youth, using their own music and their own culture to inculcate into them all kinds of desires and tastes which the society is not prepared to put them in a position to satisfy, and therefore literally tantalizing them into criminal activity. The change in the very nature of the black family. You must recognize the so-called single-headed black family is essentially a phenomena that has occurred since the 1970s. This was not typical of black adolescents before that time. You must realize the fantastic change that has occurred in the social and political nature of black life in the last 20 years. It has been profound. That is one of the reasons why you cannot compare, if you're an adult my age and maybe a bit younger, you cannot compare your adolescence on a whole with the adolescence of the current black youth today. Not by a long shot. Up to the end of the 60s and in the early 70s, the large majority of black families were still headed by two members. There were many other things going on. Now you have a situation where the largest percentage are single-headed families in the midst of all of these other things that we're talking about. And how all of these things then coalesce to create the kind of situation we're confronted with today. So if you can perhaps move back from this book back to black on black violence, and you can get a deeper sense of how then the so-called criminality and the violence of blacks against blacks is created by a social situation and a social structure. And I'm going to talk a bit later about this. Remember, and I'll make a reference already to it, but I'll make a reference again. Where is the society? When we talk about society, where is it? Is it out there? No, society is not out there. Society is where? It is where? In us. A society can only be carried within the minds and bodies of its members. It does not exist as an entity outside of the minds and bodies of people. So when we talk about a society and a social structure, it must represent itself in the behavior of people and of individuals. But of course, Eurocentric psychology likes to make you think that society exists outside and separate from people. That is logically impossible. And it's a stupidity that's perpetrated on the populations, upon our people, and often leads to serious misunderstandings, both of ourselves and of our situations. So anyway, look for an outline for understanding and remediating and preventing black adolescent violence. And while you're at it, you can also look for the other publication referred to as the falsification and mislabeling of African consciousness and behavior. Here we're going to talk about how European psychology colludes with European historiography to falsify the consciousness and minds of African people, and after falsifying them, to mislabel them and misdiagnose African people, and therefore mistreat them in the name of rehabilitation, which is one of the reasons why, of course, the so-called rehabilitative establishment never really rehabilitates so-called black-on-black criminals. They cannot afford to. The paradigm that they use is ultimately designed to maintain criminality. A third publication, which will also be coming out in January, will be one that's related more closely to the developmental psychology of the black child. It is titled Awakening the Natural Genius of African American Children. And of course, those of you who read the developmental psychology of the black child recall that the black child was born and is born with a natural head start. It is second in intellectual potential to no other children on this earth. This book then, Awakening the Natural Genius of the African American Children, then it specifically deals with the rearing approaches and educational approaches which can be used to awaken that genius that we know is there and keep it alive and develop it so that we can achieve our liberation as a people. We have a fourth publication, which is not my own, but one that I recommend. All of these will be coming out toward the end of January, so you were right, we've been quite busy. This is by Dr. Louise Spencer Strahan, called Confronting the Color Crisis in the African Diaspora, emphasis Jamaica, looking at the issues of color within an African nation and society, and how, and the ramifications that these differences in skin color have for African political, economic, and social development. So we'd appreciate your patronage and your attention. Of course, we hope that you will find these books educational. We expect by the end of February to have another publication that's tentatively titled Educating the African American Child for the 21st Century, a rationale for an African-centered education. And here we will have about 400 or 500 pages for you so that we can go in great detail about the education of our children, and we will review various educational programs. We will look at the learning styles of African American children and those kinds of things, so that those who hopefully review this book can walk away with it, or walk away from it, or use the book as a handbook to develop practical, real programs for educating our children as a way of attaining our liberation as a people. One more reminder here, I normally do not sell my own book. I generally let the books be sold by local vendors. What I'm doing here today is also letting these books be sold by Cimitap, so that 40% of the retail price goes to the Cimitap organization. as a part of contributing to what you're doing here and supporting what you're doing here. Okay, I want to talk a bit here then today about the identity crisis within the African American community, myth or reality. And this topic was provoked by a spate of articles that occurred within the newspapers, that were published in the newspapers within the last couple of weeks. And I found it very interesting, you know, that you just sort of had a simultaneous occurrence of certain events and certain writings in the newspaper. And obviously, as members of CIMATAP, you know, I'm certainly have been educated around the idea that you read newspapers not only in terms of their content, but you read them in terms of their format, in terms of the timing of stories. Why do certain stories occur at certain times? And regardless as to whether the stories contain truth or falsehood, just meditating about the time they're being published can tell you a great deal, whether they are true or false. Where they occur in the paper itself, where the articles are placed, can be very informative as well. How is news used by the establishment? What is the role of newspapers in the establishment? Do papers report the news, or do they make the news? You have to come to a newspaper and to news media with these kinds of questions in mind. Was the Leonard Jeffries controversy a situation of reporting news, or was it a situation of making news by newspapers? Was it a situation of reporting a speech or the use of a speech to create a type of consciousness and to achieve specific political and cultural goals? And what goals were being sought by these papers as they wrote about Jeffries and that controversy? It's very important to ask those questions, because some people misleadingly thought that the Jeffries controversy was about truth and falsehood, or truth and lies, and it had nothing to do with truth. That's why you never saw them debating Jeffries' documentations, never answering whether what he was saying was true or not, because that wasn't the point. And we must recognize then that often the publishing of news and so forth is not about then the publishing of truth or necessarily the publishing of lies, but about the manipulation of consciousness and about the achievement of particular social and political goals. And often they are not even about the person who is at the center of the story. The person is often secondary to the whole purpose of what's going on, and is merely a cog or a pawn being used. If you don't know that, though, you will personalize the issues and miss the whole point of what is going on. And we as people must remove ourselves from this tendency to personalize stories and issues. I'll give a quick example of that. I'm sure there are many blacks now in Louisiana who are going to sleep after having come out to the polls and voted Dukes down, and who are feeling very proud about their voting prowess, and who saw the danger as Dukes, who forgot their history, by the way, and remembered that at another time in history they were able to vote too. and those votes were taken away from them. And it took almost 100 years for them to regain the right to vote. So that, in a sense, this voting against Duke does not necessarily represent black power. It was the absence of black power during the Reconstruction that permitted the voting, the franchise that blacks had for voting to be taken away. What then makes us sure that this franchise won't be taken away again? What have we done as a people to ensure that our right to vote will be determined by our power, not by the power of others? And I think we've done relatively little in that regard. There are some who are forgetting that 55% of whites voted for David. Did those 55% of the majority of whites who voted just walk away and forget about what they were concerned with simply because Duke didn't win office, or are they still there? In other words, then, the issue moves beyond David Duke to the fact that we have a large number of whites who have certain attitudes, and those whites are still alive and well, and those attitudes are still there whether David Duke lives or dies tomorrow. So the issue is not Duke. The issue is a group of white folk, and a sizable group of white folk who has specific types of attitudes who are still there and who still then pose a threat to black freedom. In fact, Duke alone poses no threat to black folk. He's one person. You get the same kind of game that goes on with Hitler. We get the white media that projects the mad Hitler. Hitler, who through his great oratory hypnotizes the German people. That's nonsense. Hitler did not build the concentration camps alone. Hitler did not go into Poland by himself. It took a whole German nation to cooperate with Hitler. If the German nation did not accept Hitler and support Hitler, then Hitler could not have had any influence or effect on history whatsoever. But we have a media, you see, that makes you perceive Hitler as the bad guy. It was the German people in relationship to Hitler that created the problem. And in the end, then, it won't be individuals only, it will be groups of people against other groups of people. But if you have this tendency then to get caught up in individuals, you're going to miss the group phenomena, and you will miss often the organization of whole armies and whole groups of people against you. And you will be made to think simply because you vote down one individual, you have solved your problem. You could be no more wrong. You cannot be more wrong. What am I saying here then? We not only must read newspapers, but we must continue to educate ourselves in how to read them. So, in that context, I find it interesting that we get this whole spate of stories here in the last couple of weeks on identity. Some of you might have seen, what is it called, USA Today. And we have it here, I'm trying to get the date here, December 2nd, 1991. Cover story, it's titled, Dealing with the Discords of Diversity. And another one here called Producing a Paler Shade of Skin Color. And we got a picture here of Michael Jackson. Jackson, his hit song rejects color labels. That's interesting. A song is going to reject color labels. That's another thing I think we make a mistake of. We think we can just sing our troubles away, right? Sing a good song and the labels disappear. And it starts out, who's black, who's white, who's right? Increasingly high-profile African-American filmmakers, a Supreme Court nominee, even a mega-famous singer are engaging in public emotional examinations of black identity in the 90s. Is that right? Are these people really engaging in public emotional examination of black identity? And he jumps over and says, quotes Michael, "I'm not going to spend my life being a color." Ignorant. Very ignorant. As an emerging black middle class slips into the mainstream, it faces questions about the duty to stay black. I mean, black is something you just take on and take off. Is that what we have here? You know, uplift poor blacks and promote black culture. Is that what is going on in the black middle class? The black middle class now is deciding whether it will stay black. You mean it has a choice of being other than black? And is it now questioning whether it will continue to uplift poor blacks and promote black culture? These concerns are reflected in the work and action of black filmmakers, writers, artists, and others. Who's blacker? Clarence Thomas, a Thurgood Marshall. Spike Lee, a poet activist, Amiri Baraka. They've all been cross-examined in the media in racial terms. Whose media? New York Times, November 30th, 1991. In a 90s quest for black identity, intense doubts and disagreement. Lena Williams of the New York Times. I hope one day, Simitab, and maybe you're doing this already, can perhaps call together these black journalists and so forth and educate them a bit as well. So we get here, the ever-changing black experience in America is being assessed with a new intensity. Skin color, how you talk, more specifically, what you say, how you live your life, are examples of the tests being used to determine what it means to be black in the 1990s. Not since the tumultuous 1960s has there been such an intense focus on blackness. And it jumps over to, talks about books and news articles. The topic range from what's black, who's black, what's not, to black like who. Films like School Days, Living Large, Strictly Business have used satire to explore racial conflict and contradiction among blacks. And they quote psychologists from DePaul University, aside from skin color, there's something to being ethnically black in terms of outlook on life, values, and beliefs. It goes on to say, some blacks say that black Americans cannot afford to waste time on such issues when so many blacks face a multitude of problems like drug abuse, unemployment, prejudice, and the disproportion of blacks among crime victims. And it's an amazing statement here. We would argue that to a great good extent, a lot of the issues just mentioned flow from the attempt to separate us from our identity, and in many instances reflect issues around people who are trying to escape their identity. I made the argument in Black on Black violence that the black on black criminal to a great extent is a white racist in black skin. A person who has internalized white racist attitudes and has identified with his victimizers and expresses his victimization by victimizing other black people. That his behavior reflects the absence of an appropriate black and African identity. And that much of the unemployment and much of the other issues flow from an absence or an incomplete African identity. We get quotations from various experts here, including Mr. Julius Lester, a professor of Judaic studies, speaking of identity here, at the University of Massachusetts, says that being black has evolved into a form of social fascism in the past 2 decades, especially on campus. So whites have stopped being fascist and stopped ruling. So the issue now is not white fascism or white racism, but black fascism. A related article, of course, that came out again on December 2nd, 1991, Black-white marriages rise, but social acceptance lags. Then on the same page, 2 who lost their way in urban wilds. A culture of violence takes a deadly toll in East New York. Talking about the young man that was killed in the school over there. Then we came right back around here on November 25th. Gold earrings, this is the New York Times again, gold earrings and protection. More girls take road to violence. And now they're talking about young ladies who seem to be engaged more and more in violence in order to buy gold earrings and other things. And looking at our own papers here, you saw 2 pieces perhaps this weekend in the City Sun, Clinton Cox, Am I Black Enough for You? Of course, in the Cox Manor writes a very pertinent and very learned piece here. And another in the New York Amsterdam News, 2 Kinds of Blackness by Manning Marable. Cox, I think, makes some very pertinent statements here, as well as Marable, of course. It seems, according to the article, he again is referring to the New York Times pieces, that black people are no longer sure who's black. I had failed somehow to notice this phenomenon among my acquaintances. And he makes some other statements here then about the fact that, well, I don't know how the discussion is going to turn out, especially if it's carried on mainly in the white media. But then the majority population in this country always has tried to define who was and who wasn't black. And I think this is part of the key to these articles, that we have to keep in mind that the white population and the white man has always sought to define race and to define identity, and to define it in terms that would maintain his own superiority in the world, and define racial identity and put people in racial categories in ways to maintain his own status in the world or to advance his own interest. So you can begin to get some idea that this spate of articles must imply on some level that whites need to readjust racial identity and racial definition. And we must ask the question, why? To what end are they seeking to readjust this identity? We have gotten ourselves caught up in a situation which is very peculiar sometimes when it comes to racial identity, where when you look at the old white racist writers, and even many of us somewhat unconsciously get involved in this, the great part of the emphasis was on why are black people black? You know, and how did we come to have our color? And how did we come to have our texture of hair and so forth? And why are there colored people in the world? And you know, if you don't watch it, you get caught up with that. When the anomaly in the world is what? White skin. And with the vast majority of the world being what? Non-white. The issue becomes, how did these people appear in the world? How can we explain their presence in the world? But in typical white fashion, the issue is always what? Reversed. And so people get caught up in discussing the most common issue and not looking at the most uncommon one, the one that really needs explanation. How did this 10% of non-color come into the world? And how did it achieve a position in the world such that it has deigned to give itself authority to categorize the race and identity of other people? And why has these other large majorities in the world permitted this minority to do so? It sort of reminds me again of just what's going on in the real world anyway. I looked the other day and it indicated that the so-called Jewish population is 1.8% of the American population. You wouldn't think that in terms of the tremendous influence that population has in this country. And yet, when you look at it too in terms of its world population, you must again question, how is it that this speck of a group in the world population attains so much attention and has such a high profile in the world? But again, we are reversed in the way we perceive the world. We go to channel 13 to look for objective news, humanistic news. And we get these great discussions about nuclear proliferation in the third world as representing the great danger. And we get, again, the bad guy syndrome, the Hussein danger. And you got the UN over there trying to take out all of his nuclear weapons. And again, you get this personalized history, right? Saddam Hussein, has all of these nuclear weapons and was on the verge of getting these nuclear weapons and endangering the world. So Hussein by himself. When anyone would tell you that these weapons were created and brought into being by the super moralistic, humanistic Europeans who supplied him with those weapons. But yet we get this great discussion and there's not one mention of Israel and the danger that Israel represents to world peace. And the danger, the tremendous danger that a theocratic state, which is what Israel is, a state that argues that God gave them this land from the Euphrates and to this end, and Jordan is really a part of Israel, and all the way up to Damascus, that is a part of Israel, and this is a part of Israel because God said so in the Bible. You now have the most lethal mixture of genocide going when you attach great military power to religious fanaticism. And yet, you get the great Channel 13 being so concerned about the third world containing weapons. Where's the discussion about this weaponry in South Africa? Where's the discussion about the fact that the United States has been the only country that has actually used these weapons and dropped them on other people? Why aren't we talking about disarming this country? You see? But typically, as I've said many times and again, ladies and gentlemen, in order for a minority to rule this world, they have to reverse reality. They have to turn it completely around. And those who are ruled must become backwards in their perception and in their thinking and in their behavior. They too must inculcate and internalize backwardness. And they must express their freedom as a freedom only to do the wrong thing. So he talks about it here, and you can read further pieces here. Marable's piece, I think, is a very interesting piece, Two Kinds of Blackness, in the New York Amsterdam News, particularly when he talks about two ways of looking at race. One, he mentions here, race is essentially a group identity imposed on individuals. And of course, he talked about the situation that race is not purely self-chosen by a people or by an individual. It is imposed by people outside of oneself. I think I heard Karenga the other day use what I thought was a trenchant piece Trenton's statement that he said, I believe is an African proverb, that simply because you put your hand before your eyes doesn't mean the sun has gone out. And yet you have some blacks who think that in their not seeing color, the world doesn't see color, or does not see them as black. They think if they would keep their incantations going on about how they are not black, and how they choose not to live a color, and how they choose not to see the world as colored, that the world will not continue to treat them as black and see them as black. This is a foolish perception. It is a very childish and immature perception, which of course is, again, what oppression tends to do to oppress people. It tends to immaturize oppressed people and maintain and instigate a retarded development in terms of thinking in too many of our people. When we talk about this kind of thinking, we talk about this kind of thinking as occurring in children 2 and 3 and 4 years old, who think that they can hide their eyes, and by hiding their eyes, the other person disappears or goes away. Or that because they don't see the other person themselves, that the other person does not see them. And you can see this foolishness, as I've suggested, under other circumstances. You go into Bensonhurst, as Hawkins did, or you go into Howard Beach, and you keep repeating to yourself, I'm not black, I'm not black, I don't see myself as black. And you think that those people don't see you as black. In fact, it is the keen recognition that you are black and that other people see you as black that can save your life. Because you can say, I'm black, I know how these people think about black people, and I know this neighborhood, and consequently, I will approach it this way. But you go in there singing about how we are all one, and we are all one little color, and so forth. But this is a part of oppression, to motivate the oppressed to escape their very reality. And all it does in the end is, as we said in the Bensonhurst and so forth, leads ultimately to genocidal attacks. It is not for black people not to see color to transform the world. It is for other people, and particularly for whites, and I'm not waiting on that, not to see color. We are suffering not because we chose to see ourselves as colored or not colored, but because others see us in that vein and react to us in that vein, and it is for their perceptions to change. But again, you see this old martyr complex on the part of the oppressed, thinking that letting themselves be nailed to the cross is somehow going to save the world. It only is going to get you nailed to the cross. He goes on here to say then, so there are many blacks who want to see race in purely racial terms, just as a means belonging to a group who have in common a certain skin color and other physical features. And of course, then he talks about the other side of blackness, which I will refer to a bit later. So then we should ask ourselves, are these articles coincidental? Why are they being published at this juncture? What function are they playing within the political establishment? What is this concept of identity and of self? What is this concept of individuality? What is an individual anyway? We don't spend enough time thinking about that. One of the things that we must debunk immediately is the idea that a person can be completely individual and separated completely from society. In fact, individuality has no meaning other than in a society. If you are in the world completely alone, no one else existed, why would you even think about individuality? There's no meaning whatsoever. Why would you even think about identity, race, or anything else? These things come to have meaning and operate within a social context. The concept of personal and social identity takes on meaning relative to other people, relative to a social system. Identity, by its very nature, is a social concept. It is no way you're going to escape the social in your personality. One's identity begins before he or she is even born. It begins in the womb itself. The society begins to shape the personality from the very first moment of conception. However one's identity is defined and assigned, however such an identity is expressed, it has social ramifications and produces social effects. Because one acts one's identity out within a social system. I don't care how you define it. If you're living in a society, it has social effects and social influences. Individual definition and expression is achieved within the social structure. Self-identity is confirmed by repeated and relatively consistent social interactions. To have an identity means that you have some kind of boundaries around your mental and physical personality. Those boundaries have to be defined relative to those outside of those boundaries. Those boundaries are maintained by those structures and people outside. In fact, one does not achieve an identity in the fullest sense until that identity is confirmed by other people. You know, you can say, I am the king, if you want to. You can say it all you want to, but until others defer to you and bow to your presence and follow your command, in reality, you're not. It takes the behavior and attitude and the relations of other people to confirm what you may even call an individual identity. They have to relate to you in some particular set of ways. The idea then that you can have an identity unconfirmed, unrelated to a social system is totally illogical. This man who says he is neither black nor white will still turn around and call himself a singer, which requires what? An audience. People to listen, people to buy records, people to respond to him as what? A singer. If he were in the middle of the forest, totally alone, what difference would it make if he sang or not? How could he define himself? The word singer, the word dancer, only has meaning within a social, political context. It's just like the context people talk about of being independently wealthy. How are you going to be independently wealthy? These are my dollars. A dollar is nothing but a printed piece of paper. That is all it is in essence. The dollar is a social instrument and its value must be accepted by other people. Therefore, it can never belong to you alone. It only has value because it is a social instrument. You never own it by yourself, for yourself, and to yourself. If you did, it would not be accepted as what? Money. But of course, the bourgeois society wants to create this so that it can make the poor and these other people it rips off think that they do not give meaning to wealth and riches. And that ultimately, what we call wealth and what we call riches is a creation of the group, not of some person who lifts him or herself up by their bootstrap and who is a self-made person. A self-made person is self-made within a social context and is maintained in their wealth by a social context. And therefore, all of the money that they have ultimately is money that belongs to the group and is a group creation. But of course, we want to run a game on your head to take your money, use all of your money, use it against you, saying it's all mine and I'm independently wealthy. You know, we never think about, and there's so many other concepts like private property, total thievery, You never own any property. You just rent it. You said you paid for it. You finished your mortgage. Stop paying your taxes. See how long you got in it. Watch the group take it right back from you. You don't own it. You just rent it. You see? But this is the game that's run on the mind of people. What makes an individual, what makes us individual is our unique ways of integrating and expressing and relating to community, to shared social knowledge, techniques, resources, and values. The material we individualize is in essence social material, made available by a social system, a set of social relations. In other words, we are individual in our individual ways of dealing with social things and relating to social things, not that we are uniquely individual. Then we would speak our own language. You want to know that you want to really see the ultimate individual? Look at the schizophrenic in full bloom. Has his own glossolalia, salad language, living in his own total reality, disembodied, doesn't know where his body ends or begins. You know, he's all people and every people. An echo chamber, so everybody he meets, he echoes them. You know, he can't distinguish himself from anything else there. Locked in his own world, locked away from reality. And therefore, he has to now be taken care of by others because he becomes a danger to himself and sometimes others. As I said earlier, the social system is not out there, it is within each of us. The individual is a social creation. That's why individuals in different societies differ from other individuals in other societies, because they individually represent their social group. The individual helps to maintain the social situation and helps to maintain the social situation. If you are so individual, why then does social disintegration, the disintegration of a social system, leads so often to individual disintegration? People beginning to lose their minds, beginning to lose their sense of self, their sense of direction and purpose and meaning when the society itself becomes unraveled. People committing suicide during depressions and other things when jobs are lost. All of those self-made people and self-determining people all of a sudden coming loose when the social system itself begins to fall apart. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is that social structure that builds the infrastructure of the individual. And now you're going to have some jokers who want to come along and try to make you think that you can be a person totally unto yourself, and that the essence of freedom represents atomized individuals operating with no relationship to community and no communal obligations and so forth. What purpose does this kind of approach serve? We have to ask ourselves that. Those who are talking about themselves now as individuals, those such as Julius Lester, who sees being black as some form of social fascism. And I remember Julius quite well. Look out, whitey, black power's gonna get your mama, you know, and that other kind of stuff. Heavy into black, wasn't he? Used black, caught up in black. And it's interesting now, once he's achieved what being black got for him, he turns around and denies it. That's why we felt disappointed with Clarence Thomas and the other people. You're going to use it. You're going to gain the fruits from the use of blackness. You're going to get your job from our demanding quotas and other things in terms of blackness, not everybody-ness, but blackness. And now you're going to turn around and tell us that blackness has nothing to do with it, and it's not important. Interestingly, it was as a common identity, as imposed, sometimes as shared oppression, culture, politics, social behavior, acting against oppression, which to a significant degree has brought us to the present impasse. We have gotten people then who want to equate atomistic individualism with freedom. I would say, to a good degree, we're seeing this kind of thing going on in the black community, particularly by some individuals in the black community, because we perhaps didn't notice that these seeds were already a part of the so-called civil rights movement, but they were hidden by our focus and our attention on achieving our so-called civil rights and by our dealing with our obvious oppression. For many blacks, if I can recall, who fought during that time were fighting for what they call individualism and were equating individualism with freedom. Many, we realize now then, were fighting to identify with their aggressor. As Paulo Freire says, for many of the oppressed, to be free means to be like the oppressor. And consequently, there were many of us during that struggle who thought that white folks and their behavior and attitudes, their privileges and so forth, represented what it means to be free, without realizing that if to be free is to be like one's oppressor, then the day that one becomes like one's oppressor, one becomes self-oppressing. And one becomes an ally in the oppression of one's own people. And again, in black-on-black violence, this is what I'm saying, that the black-on-black violent criminal, in a sense, becomes an ally of white racism. He wants to imitate the murderous attitudes of the white man being the greatest murderer the world has ever seen, the greatest killer, robber, and rapist the world has ever known. Yes, I used to hear you say you want your children to be just like them without thinking. Our enslavers, the assassinators of our personality, those people who lynched us, those people who deprived us, those people who killed nations and nations of Indians and others, those people who, wherever they stepped on this earth, the local populations were degraded, those people who developed great death machines and polluted the earth and the world itself, those killers and murderers is what we desired to be like, and represented to many of us what it means to be free. When you take upon yourself that definition of what it means to be free, there is no wonder then that we engage in the killing of ourselves. When we identify with killers and identify with people who kill us, then we ultimately must engage in suicide and self-destruction. And this is often what has happened. There were too many who read freedom to being like white folk. And they fought then the oppression that was coming to us all, not to transform a system and not to reduce the power of an oppressive group, but to gain the right to more closely identify with their oppressors. Many were fighting using the concept of blackness not so much to identify with us, but to dissociate themselves from us. And that's almost sort of hidden in this concept of once we gain our great freedom, people would not see us as colored. They would look at us as some form of abstraction? Why can't people see you in your reality? If you are black or whatever color you are, why cannot people see you as you are? Why is it that we demand that they play some kind of perceptual trick on themselves and not see us in our reality and in the color we present to them, since they have color cones in their eyes designed to see color, and then deal with us honestly and fairly? Have we bought the idea then that if people see us in our true color, that they are bound to mistreat us? This leads us to the idea then that it is our color that is the cause of our oppression, and not the madness and insanity of others who are oppressing us. And therefore, when you internalize this kind of concept, you see freedom as dissociating yourself from your color and trying to get others not to look at your colored reality, so that both can be insane, so that the other who's looking cannot see you for who you are, and you cannot see yourself for who you are. And therefore there were those who fought as black people in order not to be seen as black people. The very essence of schizophrenia, again, and madness, is dissociation. A cutting off of the individual from his reality, and a form of alienation. There were other of us who fought and fell behind the black banner during the civil rights era, not as Maddox tells us, I think very importantly here, Attorney Maddox, not so much for civil rights as for consumer rights. And it becomes sort of interesting that the civil rights struggle centered around lunch counters and retail stores. And you begin to realize that while this certainly was not the whole of civil rights, that there was an aspect having to do with consumption. The right to take our money and give it to people who hated our guts. And we see this still going on today. And again, we talk about this in black on black violence. People don't want to live next to you, hate the sight of you, miseducate the children, want to continue their oppression. And then what do? Beat each other up so that we can carry our money to them, buy the bus loads, and feel proud of ourselves and feel good